suspects that the beginning of manipulation could start with a simple question: would you like a cup of coffee? It sounds harmless. In fact, it feels polite, almost warm. But beneath that casual offer lies a tactic as old as language itself, the yes ladder, a psychological tool so subtle, so disarmingly effective, it can shift fortunes, win elections, break marriages, and seal million-dollar deals. And yet, most people never see it coming. This is not just a story about influence. This is a story about how one yes can lead to another and another, until you've agreed to something you swore you never would. And it all begins with the first step up the ladder. In 1966, psychologist Jonathan Friedman and his colleague Scott Fraser conducted what would become one of the most unsettling experiments in social psychology. They called it the foot in the door technique. The setup was simple. They asked homeowners in California to put a large, ugly "Drive carefully" sign on their lawns. Most said no, but in another neighborhood, the researchers tried a different approach. They first asked if the homeowners would place a tiny sticker in their window, a modest sign supporting road safety. Almost everyone agreed. Then 2 weeks later, they returned with the same ugly lawn sign. This time, 76% said yes. That's a 400% increase in compliance. The sticker was the first step, the tiny yes, the harmless commitment that made it harder to say no later. This isn't just theory, it's biology. The human brain craves consistency. Once we've said yes to something, especially publicly, we unconsciously want our next decision to align with that first one. We don't like to contradict ourselves. We'd rather be consistently wrong than admit we were wrong at all. And that's where the yes ladder begins. New York, January. Blizzards howl outside Grand Central Station. Inside, a man in his 30s, sharply dressed in a tailored charcoal coat, walks briskly toward track 27. His name is Daniel Corman, but no one here knows that. To the woman on the bench, reading a paperback, sipping stale station coffee, he's just a polite stranger. "Excuse me," he says with a disarming smile. "Do you know if this train goes to Stamford?" She looks up, nods. "Yeah, it does. Thanks. I always second-guess myself with these tracks." She chuckles. "Tell me about it." "Mind if I sit here?" he asks. Another yes. In under 60 seconds, Daniel has already gotten two. And as the train arrives and they step aboard, something shifts. The woman, Julia, doesn't know it yet, but she's already climbing his ladder. Every agreeable nod, every polite response, makes her more susceptible to the next step. He's not trying to sell her anything, not yet, but he will. The yes ladder isn't just for sales or scams. It plays a role in dating too. Imagine a first date. The person across from you smiles and says, "You like sushi, right?" You nod. "Want to try that place on Fifth Avenue next weekend?" You're already halfway to yes. Robert Cialdini, in his landmark book Influence, explains this perfectly. People who agree to a small favor are significantly more likely to agree to a bigger one later, not because of pressure, but because of identity. Saying yes reshapes how we see ourselves. If you say yes to helping a stranger move a couch, you might say yes to pet sitting for them a week later, because you've started to believe you're the kind of person who helps them. It becomes your story. In relationships, this becomes magnetic. The person who gets us to say yes, even to little things, builds emotional momentum. We feel aligned, in sync, connected. But what happens when that momentum is used not for connection, but control? In 2003, a chilling case unfolded in Virginia. A car dealership employee named Marcus had been arrested for fraud and manipulation. But it wasn't his actions alone that shocked investigators. It was how easily his victims had complied. He didn't threaten them. He didn't blackmail them. He simply started small. Could you verify your address for our records? Can I get your signature here to confirm delivery? Would you mind showing me your ID again? Each request seemed reasonable, harmless even, but each yes led deeper into a web of false promises and stolen data. By the time the victims realized what was happening, they had already handed over enough to destroy their credit, lose their savings, even face legal trouble themselves. Why didn't they say no? Because saying no, after so many yeses, felt unnatural. The yes ladder had done its work. If you've ever signed a petition, you've climbed the first step of a political yes ladder. In 2008, Barack Obama's campaign launched a grassroots movement that revolutionized digital persuasion. The strategy: don't start by asking for money or votes. Start by asking for support in principle. Do you believe healthcare should be affordable? Do you think young people deserve better education? Do you want change in Washington? Most people said yes. Then came the next ask. Would you sign this petition? Can you volunteer an hour of your time? Would you consider donating $10? Each step built momentum. Each yes fed the next. By the time election day arrived, millions had already invested themselves in the narrative, not just with their wallets, but their identities. They weren't just voters, they were change makers. All because they climbed the ladder, one step at a time. The yes ladder is neutral, like fire or a knife. It can be used for good or ill. Used ethically, it builds bridges, teachers helping students commit to learning, therapists guiding clients towards self-discovery, activists sparking slow, lasting reform. Used unethically, it becomes a trap. Abusive partners easing boundaries, grifters grooming victims, dictators turning civilians into soldiers. The danger lies not in the tool, but in how easily it bypasses the conscious mind. You're on Instagram. A wellness page asks, do you care about your mental health? You tap yes. Next post, would you try a 5-minute breathing exercise? Yes. Then subscribe to our course for $299. Wait, what? It sounds absurd, but click-through data from major platforms shows that micro-engagements, likes, polls, tiny responses, significantly increase conversions later. It's not just clever marketing, it's ladder psychology. Apps like Duolingo or Headspace use a similar path. Try one lesson. You're on a 3-day streak. Want to go pro? Yes, yes, maybe yes again. We feel committed because we said yes before, and breaking that pattern feels like breaking a promise to ourselves. What if you could use this power for yourself, not to manipulate, but to build, to connect, to persuade ethically? What if instead of being dragged up someone else's ladder, you built your own? In the next part we'll explore how some of the world's top negotiators, influencers, and even cult leaders structure their ladders, and how one teenager from Sweden used the same method to launch a global revolution. The question is, will you keep climbing? Daniel didn't plan on using the ladder that day, not intentionally, not with the precision of a trained manipulator, but like many who learn the technique instinctively. He'd begun to notice that people said yes more often when he didn't push, when he simply asked small things, patiently, warmly, without pressure. It had started years earlier, when he worked as a server in a midtown restaurant. Tourists were easier, locals more guarded, but both types responded the same way when you made them feel in control. Would you like still or sparkling? Was always better than what do you want to drink? Frame choice. Smaller ask. A simple yes to water often led to dessert. He learned quickly, if you want the bigger answer, start with the tiny one they won't notice. On the train, he asked Julia whether she liked winter, just a way to pass time. She smiled and said yes. He asked if she grew up around snow. Yes again. You ever feel like everything important in your life started in winter? He asked, staring out the window as ice crusted over the Hudson. There was a pause. She tilted her head. Actually, yes. That's weird. I've never thought about that. But now she had. The conversation deepened. From there it wasn't hard. I'm heading to an event later, he said as they pulled into Stamford. Art and wine. Nothing big. You should come if you're free. He didn't expect her to say yes immediately. But she did. A few soft yeses, and the rest fell like dominoes. She didn't know that the conversation had followed a neurological script. In 2021, a study published in Nature Neuroscience revealed that every affirmative response activates reward circuits in the brain. Saying yes literally feels good. The ventral striatum lights up. Even the simple act of nodding triggers subtle dopamine release. The brain begins associating the speaker, the one who elicited that yes, with positive reinforcement. It's primitive, but powerful. That's why we trust people who agree with us. That's why we comply with those who make agreement easy. It's not that we're weak, it's that we're wired that way. 3 days later, Julia was at his apartment. They hadn't slept together, not yet, but the emotional intimacy had accelerated. Daniel asked if she wanted to see his favorite film. She said yes. Halfway through, he asked if she believed in fate. Another yes. These weren't tests, they were threads in a net, quietly weaving. Julia couldn't see it forming, but each new affirmation was less about Daniel, and more about the version of herself she now performed in his presence. She was agreeable, curious, open. To say no now would be to rupture her new identity. Meanwhile, across the country, a different ladder was rising. This one not in love, but in business. Silicon Valley, where tech startups pitch with impossible charm and improbable numbers. At a venture capital conference in Palo Alto, a young founder named Priya walked into a room full of doubters. Her company, a biotech app that claimed to predict hormonal shifts from saliva data, had already raised $2 million. But today, she needed 5 more. She didn't start by asking for millions. She began with a simpler question. Would you agree that women's health has been historically underfunded? Heads nodded. Yes. Would you agree that personalized medicine is the future? More yeses. And would you agree that diagnostics shouldn't rely on 19th century models? One by one, the investors leaned forward. She had not pitched her company yet, but she had built the moral scaffolding around it. To say no to her now would mean contradicting their own values, the ones they just affirmed in front of their peers. 20 minutes later, Priya walked out with signed interest from 2 of the top funds in the room. This method, the shaping of identity through pre-commitment, is what behavioral economists call self-perception theory. It suggests that we understand who we are not by introspection, but by observing our own behavior. If I said yes to that, I must believe it. And if I believe it, I must be the kind of person who says yes to things like this. It's recursive, it loops, and with each repetition, it hardens. This same logic is used by modern cults, but not as bluntly as you'd expect. They don't recruit by promising salvation. They begin with a survey. Do you believe life has a deeper meaning? Have you ever felt misunderstood by society? Do you believe the world is broken? The answers come easily. No red flags, just gentle curiosity. Then come invitations. Join us for a free talk. Come to our retreat. Try this meditation. Yes, yes. Months later, members are selling their belongings, cutting ties with families, and standing on the edge of irreversible commitment, all because they walked one step at a time. In one of the most infamous modern cases, the NXRVM organization, which billed itself as a self-help community, used this tactic extensively. Former members later testified that the founder, Keith Renier, never made demands directly. He simply nudged people into roles. Can you help me with this task? Would you be willing to support a friend in need? Do you believe in challenging your limits? By the time he asked for loyalty pledges and branding rituals, his followers had said yes so many times. Saying no had become unthinkable. But not all ladders are sinister. Some change the world for good. In Sweden, a 15-year-old girl named Greta stood alone with a sign that read, "Skullstreck for climate." No chants, no crowds, just one quiet question.
Do you care about the future of the planet? It started with sympathetic glances, then conversations, then others skipping school beside her. Each yes built the movement. Within months, she was addressing the United Nations, not because she demanded power, but because she built a ladder so simple, so honest, others couldn't help but climb it. Every agreement became action. Every step brought more. This is the yes ladder at its highest form. Consensus into change. And yet every ladder has a cost. Even ethical influence carries responsibility. What if the person at the top isn't trustworthy? What if the structure leads somewhere neither party expected? Influence is momentum. Once it begins, it rarely stops where you planned. Daniel never meant to hurt Julia. He didn't consider himself manipulative. But after 3 months, she asked if he wanted to define their relationship. He hesitated, said maybe. She looked confused. But we've been doing all this, I thought. Her voice trailed off. He smiled faintly. I never promised anything. And that was true. He hadn't. But her yeses, to dinners, to weekends, to little rituals, had filled in the blanks. She had built the meaning. He had only allowed it. That night, she left his apartment with tears in her eyes. Not because he'd broken a promise, but because she'd climbed a ladder he was never on. The fall was her own. To this day, she still doesn't understand when it started. She only knows she kept saying yes.
The power of pause, just 2 seconds of silence before answering a tough question, can make you look more intelligent, more in control, and sometimes even more dangerous. He didn't blink when they asked. That's what struck the room first. A packed boardroom in downtown Chicago, 14 men and 3 women around a glass table, $1 million suits and sculpted haircuts, waiting for him to answer. The question had been direct. So, Mr. Vale, how do you explain the missing $1.2 million? And he paused, not a long pause, just 2 seconds, enough to notice, enough to rattle. He looked at the partner across from him with the expression of someone who had heard the question before, the expression of someone who knew something others didn't. Then he said, calm and even, would you like to see the trail? The way the tension deflated in that room was chemical. Something had shifted. It wasn't that they trusted him now. It was that he was no longer the one under pressure. That's the psychological weight of the pause, not because silence is dramatic, but because it breaks a pattern. The brain expects reaction. It's hardwired for response. A question triggers anxiety. Will this person fight, defend, lie, retreat? When they do none of that, when instead they pause, the amygdala hesitates. It watches, waits, and in that window of uncertainty, control flips. It's a tactic used by interrogators, spies, negotiators, and seasoned liars, but also by the most emotionally intelligent people in the world, because pausing isn't just strategy, it's regulation. The ability to insert space between stimulus and response is the heart of cognitive control, and that control, in high-stakes moments, is power. In 2015, a study at the University of California, Santa Barbara, monitored job interviews with over 300 candidates. Applicants who paused briefly, just 2 to 3 seconds, before answering difficult or unexpected questions were rated significantly higher in perceived intelligence, composure, and trustworthiness. Those who answered immediately were seen as either nervous or rehearsed. Not only that, but brain scans revealed that the listeners themselves became more attentive during the pause. Silence activated parts of their auditory cortex, normally dormant in conversation. They literally listened harder. One of the most iconic examples of this happened in 1960, during the first ever televised presidential debate between John F. Kennedy. Nixon, sweaty and defensive, answered quickly, too quickly, as if trying to win by volume. Kennedy, by contrast, paused. He seemed unfazed, unhurried, collected, and even though radio audiences believed Nixon had edged him out, the TV audience, watching the silences, the gaze, the calm, overwhelmingly believed Kennedy had won. That debate, historians say, changed the election, and all because of pauses. But silence is more than strategy in politics or business. It's a weapon in interrogation rooms. At 3:27 p.m., inside a nondescript building in Warsaw, a CIA-trained agent named Eva Moravec sat across from a man with blood on his cuffs. They had been in that room for 19 minutes. Every question so far had been deflected. He laughed once, smirked. When she asked where he'd been the night of March 14th, he scoffed and leaned back. With friends. She said nothing. 4 seconds passed. He shifted slightly. 8 seconds. His foot tapped once. 10 seconds. Finally he said, "Look, it's not what you think." She didn't interrupt. She let the silence expand like a vacuum. And slowly, word by word, he filled it. What most people don't realize is that silence is unbearably loud to the guilty. In psychology, it's called cognitive dissonance arousal, when the brain, in absence of resolution, creates its own noise. The prefrontal cortex begins inventing explanations, justifications, imaginary dialogues. The discomfort becomes intolerable, and the easiest way to soothe it is speak. That's why in hostage negotiations, trained officers use a tactic called strategic silence. When a perpetrator threatens violence, they don't react. They acknowledge, then pause. The lack of escalation unnerves the captor, because they're used to conflict, not calm, and calm, in moments of threat, feels alien. It introduces self-doubt, and doubt opens the door to de-escalation. In personal relationships too, the pause is transformative. Imagine this. Your partner says, "Do you even care about what I'm going through?" And instead of immediately defending yourself, instead of rushing in with, "Of course I do. What are you talking about?" you pause, just 2 seconds. Long enough to really hear the question, long enough for your body to calm down, for your breath to steady. Then you say, "Yes, I just didn't know how to show it." Now instead of arguing, you're connecting. The pause gave space for empathy. Neuroscientist Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett explains this as part of the brain's interoceptive system, the mechanism by which we read our own internal signals. Pausing allows us to detect the rise of anger, anxiety, or fear before they hijack the response. It gives our rational mind time to catch up with our emotional reflexes, and people who can do that consistently, in meetings, in relationships, in crises, are perceived as stable, wise, and strong, not because they're louder, because they don't rush. In a Tokyo boardroom, a billionaire deal fell apart because one man answered too fast. The company, a generational family business, had been considering foreign investment for the first time in 140 years. The negotiator from New York, smooth and sharp, pitched aggressively. When asked if he would consider a partial merger with shared governance, he answered before they finished the sentence, "Of course not." Silence followed, but this time it wasn't tactical, it was cultural. In Japan, silence is not awkward, it's respect. They waited for him to correct himself, to pause, to show humility. He didn't. The room closed like a fist. Deal dead. 1 second slower, 1 beat of breath, and that signature might have been history. In the military, commanders are trained to pause before issuing critical orders. The pause is not weakness, it's clarity. It signals that the leader isn't reacting emotionally, but calculating. In life and death moments, that pause communicates confidence and inspires it in others. Not everyone learns this. In fact, some of us are conditioned to fear silence. In Western culture especially, silence is seen as discomfort. In conversation, we rush to fill gaps. Teachers call on you faster if you pause. Interviewers interpret hesitation as uncertainty. We're taught that fast equals smart, but in truth, speed often masks insecurity. It's those who can sit in silence, who aren't afraid of it, that others follow. A child once asked a rabbi, "Why did God create silence?" The rabbi answered, "So we could hear what matters." There is a story of a woman named Amara,
a crisis negotiator in South Africa. She had prevented 12 suicide attempts in 5 years, not with speeches, not with persuasion, with silence. One time, she found herself on the edge of a rooftop with a teenager, trembling and high on meth. Amara said only one thing: "You're not alone." Then she sat for 18 minutes, not a single word. Eventually, the boy asked her, "Why aren't you talking?" She said, "Because it's your pain, not mine." He wept and stepped down. That is the power of a pause. When you don't rush to fix, to explain, to impress, you let the moment breathe. And sometimes, the breath is enough. There was a rumor in Moscow's intelligence circles. A man known only as the librarian had once stalled an entire interrogation by saying nothing for over 2 hours. It wasn't refusal. He didn't resist. He simply waited. The story went that his silence was so unnerving, his captors started second-guessing the legitimacy of their own information. That when they asked if he was trained by GRU, he simply looked at them and blinked. Once, one of the interrogators left the room. Another demanded a lawyer. Eventually, they let him go. No one could confirm if the rumor was true, but the idea of it, of silence being so powerful, it reversed pressure, spread like wildfire among field agents. It became doctrine. He who speaks first loses. This wasn't just urban legend. In 2019, a declassified CIA psychological field manual acknowledged silence as one of the top 5 passive pressure tactics. Alongside mirroring, pace control and ambiguous nodding, the pause was listed as a way to manipulate flow without verbal dominance, not with power, but with restraint, because in the absence of sound, projection begins. The other side starts to fill the vacuum, with doubt, with confession, with fear, with hope. In therapy, this same principle heals. Dr. Evelyn Marquez, a trauma psychologist in Toronto, described how patients often reveal their deepest wounds, not in the therapist's words, but in their silences. "When I stopped trying to fix," she said, "they started speaking differently. Their stories weren't rehearsed, they emerged." She had once asked a patient, "What do you remember about that day?" The woman said, "Not much," then went quiet. Dr. Marquez waited. 1 second, 2, 10. The woman shifted, her eyes brimmed, and she whispered, "I remember his watch ticking." That detail, one she'd never shared before, became the keystone of her healing, not because the question was clever, but because the pause made space for memory. Even in law enforcement, silence is measured and tactical. In the FBI's hostage rescue team, agents are taught what's called the 5-second rule. When a suspect says something shocking, confusing, or aggressive, the agent counts to 5, slowly, before responding. The purpose isn't to delay, it's to destabilize. People expect counterforce. That when none comes, they become uncertain, and uncertainty makes people vulnerable to influence, to empathy, sometimes even to surrender. On a very different battlefield, a 23-year-old woman named Annika learned this truth, not in an agency, but on live television. She had made it to the finals of an international debate competition in Berlin. The hall was silent as her opponent, a man nearly twice her age, finished a blistering argument, polished, fast, loud, his final line cut like a blade. And that is why her position is not only naive but dangerous. All eyes turned to her. She stepped forward, took the mic, and didn't speak. 1 second, 2, 3. People started shifting in their seats. Then she said, "Dangerous is a word that silences women." The crowd didn't just listen, they leaned in, because the pause had cracked the air. What followed wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a moment. That night, she didn't just win the debate, she went viral, and received an invitation to speak at the UN. The pause had made her unforgettable. This same effect echoes in media. Even in fast-saturated platforms like TikTok and YouTube Shorts, there's a psychological hook, known as temporal dissonance. It happens when a creator pauses unexpectedly, in the middle of a thought, just long enough to trigger discomfort. A millisecond too short, and the viewer scrolls, but just right, and the brain holds tension. The viewer stays, because something unresolved has been introduced. The pause promises something more. and our brains are wired to seek completion. That's why some of the top-performing videos in 2024 use micro-pauses before punchlines, dramatic turns, or reveals. Silence becomes the bait, and the mind, craving resolution, waits just long enough to fall in. In advertising, the pause is gold. One 2022 campaign for a luxury car brand aired a black screen with no sound for 2 full seconds before the logo appeared. The result, a 21% increase in retention over previous campaigns. Why? Because in the noise, silence becomes a signal. It tells the brain, this matters. But here's the twist. The pause only works when it's real, when it's earned. If it's forced, if it's gimmick, it fails. Because humans are exquisitely attuned to authenticity. A fake pause feels like delay. A real pause feels like depth. The difference is presence. That's why spiritual traditions, across continents and centuries, use silence not just as discipline, but revelation. In Tibetan monasteries, novice monks are taught to pause before every sentence, not to speak slowly, but to speak deliberately. Your words, the abbot once told a disciple, should arrive only after your soul does. In silence, they say, the self reveals itself. That's why the most powerful mantras begin and end in stillness. Even in modern leadership, silence marks true presence. Angela Merkel, during her years as German Chancellor, was known for her silences. In press conferences, she would pause after questions longer than any of her peers, sometimes 6 seconds. Journalists would fidget, cameras would zoom, but she never rushed. And when she finally spoke, the words felt earned, trusted, because they came from stillness, not panic. Compare that to someone who scrambles to fill space, who drowns you in qualifiers, ums and nervous speed. We trust the pause not because of what it hides, but because of what it refuses to fake. There's an ancient story from the courts of Emperor Ashoka. A man stood accused of treason. When asked why he betrayed his kingdom, he replied instantly, passionately, desperately. He swore loyalty, swore innocence, swore oaths in front of gods. And yet, the emperor turned to his ministers and said, he lies. How do you know? They asked. Because he was too quick to answer. The next man brought in was silent. He took a breath. He spoke slowly, with tremor. Ashoka listened, then set him free, because the pause had revealed something urgent, something real. In our lives we race, we scroll, we respond faster than we feel. But every time we choose to pause, even for 2 seconds, we are reclaiming something sacred. Attention, clarity, power. In a hospital waiting room in Sao Paulo, a woman learns her child may have leukemia. The doctor sits across from her, white coat folded, hands calm. She looks at him. He opens his mouth to speak, then stops. Just for a second, he breathes, and says, we'll go through this together. That pause, just 2 seconds, made the words believable, because in the pause, he gave her dignity. That's what the power of pause is. It's not silence, it's space, and sometimes, space is the only thing that lets the truth in.
The mirror technique, the subtle art of mimicking another's body language, tone, and gestures, a method so primal, it can make a stranger trust you without knowing why. The man had been watching her for 46 minutes. He hadn't said a word, just leaned back, in the shadowed corner of the Vienna cafe, stirring a lukewarm espresso. His name was Elias, 42, Belgian, no children, at least officially. The woman across from him, dressed in a dark coat, with a faded scarf, had eyes that moved like they were trying to decode the room. Her name wasn't real, but that didn't matter. What mattered was her posture, the way she sipped her tea, and kept her shoulders slightly tucked in, as if unsure whether to flee or freeze. Elias waited. When she crossed her right ankle over her left, he did the same. When she scratched the side of her thumb, so did he, softly, just once. And when she glanced toward the exit and exhaled, he let his breath fall too, almost in sync. She didn't notice, not consciously. That's the trick. The mirror must be invisible, but something inside her was already adjusting, tuning itself to this familiar rhythm. to then he leaned in and spoke. One sentence, quiet, confident, matching her tone. Tell me what they want from you. She didn't ask how he knew. She answered, because he felt like her. This is the hidden machinery of the mirror technique, the act of becoming someone's reflection without them realizing it. FBI negotiators use it to lower defenses. Therapists use it to gain access to the unspoken. Political leaders use it to charm entire crowds. But the most dangerous practitioners use it not for connection, but for control. The science is startling. In 1992, a team of neuroscientists in Parma, Italy, discovered something now known as mirror neurons. While studying macaque monkeys, they noticed that certain neurons in the monkeys' brains fired not only when the animals performed an action, like grabbing a peanut, but also when they watched someone else do it. The brain, in essence, mirrored the action, as if preparing to do it itself. Humans have this too. It's the reason we wince when we see someone stub their toe, or tear up when a stranger cries. Our nervous system doesn't just observe emotion, it echoes it. This is empathy at the hardware level. When someone mirrors our posture, our tone, our tempo, our brain says, they are me, and if they are me, I can trust them. It's instinct, ancient, beyond words, which is why, in 2001, an undercover agent embedded with a Colombian cartel used nothing but mirroring to survive. He was called Cobra in the files. His job was to blend, not lead, not fake bravado, just blend. During meetings with mid-tier smugglers, he mirrored. When they leaned, he leaned. When they laughed with breathy pauses, he did too. He didn't copy, he harmonized. Subtle echoes, shared gestures. Over time, they started finishing his sentences. They brought him deeper, into planning rooms, into code words. One day, a gun was placed on the table. The boss, a thin man with silver rings and the eyes of a lizard, looked directly at Cobra and said, "You feel like family." That sentence saved his life. He walked out 3 months later with a hard drive and 6 names. The operation became one of the DEA's biggest wins that year, not because of firepower, because of a mirror. But mirroring isn't just for high-stakes diplomacy or espionage. It happens in bars, on dates, in interviews. A study published in the Journal of Nonverbal Behavior in 2009 found that job candidates who subtly mirrored the interviewer's body language were rated as significantly more likable, competent, and confident. They weren't more qualified, they just reflected what the interviewer projected. In dating, it's even more primal. In a hidden camera experiment by Dr. Tanya Chartrand at NYU, 2 strangers were asked to sit and talk for 10 minutes. In half the sessions, one participant was secretly told to match the other's posture and gestures subtly. Afterward, those who were mirrored consistently reported higher trust and connection, even though they couldn't identify what had been different. Their brain had already decided, I know this person. In politics, this technique becomes theatrical. Watch any skilled politician. Bill Clinton was legendary for it. When shaking hands, he'd mirror the exact stance of the voter. If they spoke softly, he lowered his voice. If they leaned in, he did too. It wasn't flattery, it was tribalism, hard-coded. I am like you, you are like me, let's connect. And yet, there's a dark edge to the mirror. Con artists have long used it to bypass suspicion. Frank Abagnale Jr., the legendary fraudster portrayed in Catch Me If You Can, wasn't just good at forging checks. He was a master of rapport. He once said, the easiest way to gain someone's trust is to become the version of themselves they want to see. That's mirroring with a twist, not just physical, emotional, psychological, reflecting not who someone is, but who they wish they were. In 2014, a woman named Clara in Belgium lost nearly €200,000 to a man she met online. He never asked for money directly, he just listened, mirrored her interests, her grief, her values. Slowly, subtly, He became the echo of her loneliness. It felt like I was falling in love with myself, she said later. When he finally asked for a loan, she didn't hesitate, because helping him felt like helping herself. That's the real danger of the mirror, when you're not sure where you end and the other begins. But used with integrity, it can unlock impossible doors. In a prison just outside Munich, a reform program introduced a new therapist named Jacob. Instead of confronting the inmates, Jacob mirrored them. He sat like them, breathed like them. When they cursed, he didn't flinch. When they shouted, he didn't escalate. Over time, their behavior changed. They spoke more, argued less, fights decreased. One inmate said, "It was like talking to someone who already forgave you." That's the secret. The mirror doesn't judge, it reflects. And in that reflection, people feel seen, truly seen, often for the first time. It was raining when the FBI entered the motel outside Kansas City, room 9, top floor. The man inside was considered volatile, known for unpredictable rage, multiple arrests, and a record of escaping interrogation with silence or violence. But this time, they brought in Special Agent Reese Turner. He had no badge on display, no cuffs in hand, just a bottle of water and a worn notebook. He stepped into the room, nodded, and sat, not across, but slightly angled, matching the suspect's slouch without exaggerating it. He opened the water bottle with the same hand the man had used moments earlier. He placed his notebook on his lap, same side, and then without speaking, he waited. It took only 4 minutes. The suspect asked, "What's your name?" Reese answered calmly, mirroring the man's tone. "Reese, why are you here?" Reese mirrored again. "Same reason as you, trying to get out of something." Did that crack the wall? 3 hours later, the man confessed not just to the charge under review, but to 3 others. Long cold. Mirroring doesn't break people, it melts their armor, not by force, but by belonging. It's why some of the most charismatic cult leaders in history, Jim Jones, Marshall Applewhite, even Charles Manson, weren't loud. They were quiet reflectors. They didn't impose identity, they reflected it. Their followers said things like, "He understood me without speaking," or "You was like a version of me I couldn't become on my own." That's not coincidence. That's applied mirroring, calibrated to emotional need. In courtroom settings, the mirror becomes chess. A skilled lawyer will match the cadence of a witness, gently guide the tone. Prosecutors may slow their speech when dealing with grieving victims. Defense attorneys mirror emotional restraint when working with forensic experts. All of it is intentional. Mirroring establishes rapport. Rapport shifts trust, and trust shifts outcomes. But there's a line. When mirroring becomes too obvious, too robotic, the effect snaps. In 2018, during a tech startup Series A pitch, a young founder named Colin tried using a mirroring strategy he'd read about online. He copied the investor's posture, mirrored her phrasing. He even forced a slight laugh to match hers. But it wasn't seamless. It was studied. Midway through the pitch, the investor leaned back and said, "Are you trying to mirror me?" Colin froze. The room turned cold. He didn't get the funding. This is the cost of fake reflection. It triggers what psychologists call the uncanny empathy effect, like the uncanny valley in robotics, where something is almost human, but not quite. This subtle misalignment creates tension instead of connection. The brain senses inauthenticity, and instead of trust, it locks down. Mirroring is not mimicry. Mimicry copies. Mirroring listens. On platforms like TikTok and YouTube, this distinction is everything. Creators who build massive audiences often do so by embodying the emotional rhythm of their viewers, not just content, but energy. In 2023, one of the fastest growing self-help creators went viral, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Every phrase matched the pace of his comment section. When people vented in sadness, he slowed. When they raged, he echoed righteous anger. One viewer wrote, "It's like he's inside my head." That is mirror mastery,
in the digital age. Even algorithms have started to exploit it. AI voice assistants in advanced UX systems now subtly adjust tone based on user input. A 2022 study from MIT found that people rated mirrored digital voices, those that adjusted to their emotional state, as 36% more trustworthy than static ones. One participant said, "It felt like the app cared." But the mirror doesn't only move forward, it pulls backward, too. In trauma therapy, mirroring helps patients re-enter memory safely. A trained therapist mirrors the patient's breathing, tempo, and nonverbal cues. This creates neurobiological alignment. The patient doesn't feel analyzed, they feel accompanied, and that difference can determine whether a memory stays sealed or finally begins to heal. There's a case from London. A man named Arun, 37, refused to speak in session for weeks. Every attempt at conversation shut him down. But one day, the therapist began to mirror his posture, his breathing, not obviously, just enough to shift the dynamic. Over time, he began to look up, then to speak. His first words were, "I didn't think anyone could stand being with me." What the therapist mirrored wasn't just his body, it was his pain. That's what mirroring offers when used honestly. Companionship in places where isolation has hardened. But there's one place where the mirror gets weaponized more dangerously than anywhere else. Interrogation under false pretenses. In 2009, a man named Lucas in the southern US was brought in on suspicion of arson. For the first hour, officers mirrored his behavior: slouched shoulders, tired posture, anxious hand movements. But they weren't building trust for empathy. They were building comfort to extract. When they asked leading questions, they nodded slightly. When he hesitated, subtle encouragement. And when he asked, "Did someone say I was there?" they mirrored his phrasing. Could be someone thought they saw something. In that mirror his own doubt grew. Hours later, he signed a confession. He was innocent. 2 years later, DNA cleared him. The mirror had trapped him in his own reflection. Because mirrors don't tell you the truth. They tell you what you're ready to believe. And sometimes, that's more dangerous than a lie. In your daily life, you're being mirrored more than you realize. The waiter who matches your joke tempo, the colleague who uses your slang, the stranger who nods before answering. Most of them aren't conscious of it. Some are, but your brain is always scanning safe or threat, us or them, mirror or mask. And here's the most chilling truth. Sometimes, the person mirroring you doesn't know they're doing it. We are social creatures. We adapt, we reflect, we align. Because to survive in a tribe, you had to blend. The mirrored one was spared. The outsider wasn't. So the next time someone makes you feel deeply understood, so quickly it feels unreal, ask yourself, are they listening or just reflecting? That question alone could save your reputation, your heart, or your life.
Use people's names. Speaking someone's real name triggers something ancient: attention, recognition, and trust. In a world full of noise, saying David or Aisha cuts through it like a signal through static. He said her name only once, and it changed everything. Layla, that was it. No pleading, no explanation, just her name. Gently, like he was remembering it, after a long absence. They hadn't spoken in 5 years. She was sitting at a table with 2 colleagues, in a Lisbon cafe, reviewing slides, sipping espresso, and then came that sound, that syllable, that intimacy. Layla. She turned before she could stop herself. Her eyes scanned, froze. There he was, coat draped over one shoulder, half smile on his lips, eyes older. It was impossible, or maybe inevitable, but in that moment, one word had undone 5 years of silence. One word had undone her defenses. Names do that. In psychology, it's called the cocktail party effect, coined in the 1950s by British cognitive scientist Colin Cherry. The phenomenon explains how our brain filters noise. At any crowded event, a bar, a party, a train station, we tune out irrelevant chatter. But if someone across the room says our name, we hear it instantly. Why? Because our brain is wired to prioritize self-relevance. Our name is more than identity. It's a beacon, a thread in the noise. That's why great leaders and dangerous manipulators never forget names. In 2004, at a rally in North Carolina, a young woman in the third row asked then Senator Barack Obama a question. It wasn't a remarkable question, something about education policy, but his answer began with, "That's a great point. Alyssa, not ma'am, not you." He had asked her name when she stood, and now he used it. The crowd noticed. She blushed. He smiled. That moment, small as it was, showed presence, attention, humanity. Later in interviews, she said, "It felt like he saw me." That's what names do. They collapse distance. But the effect isn't only emotional, it's neurological. In 2006, researchers at UCLA used fMRI scans to study how the brain responds to hearing one's own name. When participants heard their name, even spoken by a stranger, regions associated with self-processing lit up: the medial prefrontal cortex, the inferior parietal lobule, and surprisingly, even areas tied to autobiographical memory. Just hearing their name activated their identity, their past, their emotional core. No other word had that effect. This is why in hostage negotiations, FBI agents are trained to ask names early and use them repeatedly, not forcefully, but gently, like anchors. The moment a captor hears their name in a calm, controlled voice, a crack forms, because the name brings them back to before, to when they were not just the armed man in a locked room, but Hora, or Malik, or Thomas, and those names carry memories of a mother, a teacher, a friend, a self-worth salvaging. In one real case from 1997, a man holding 2 hostages in a bank in Oregon refused food, refused to speak, until the negotiator said, "Victor, I know you don't want to be here. I know something broke, but I also know this isn't who you are." Silence. Then a voice, "You don't know me, but I know your name. Victor, I know someone named you, and they didn't name you for this." He surrendered 4 hours later. It sounds like poetry, but it's neurochemical. When we hear our name, oxytocin, the bonding hormone, often surges, especially when spoken in a warm or familiar tone. Even in cold situations, a soft repetition of our name can reduce cortisol levels. It signals safety, recognition, inclusion. That's why salespeople who use your name early and often close more deals. It's also why con artists ask your name quickly, because the moment you give it, they use it. Kara, I totally understand what you're saying. John, you're a smart guy. I can tell. That repetition isn't politeness. It's a hook, but not all name usage is manipulation. Sometimes it's rescue. In a school in Berlin, a young boy named Amar had stopped speaking after his father was deported. For months, teachers tried everything. But one day, a substitute teacher noticed Amar tracing something with his finger under the desk. She leaned down and whispered, "That's your name, isn't it?" He didn't answer, but she continued, "Amar, it means long life in Sanskrit. Did you know that?" He looked up. That afternoon, he spoke his first sentence in weeks. His name had reminded him he existed. Names, after all, are identity. That's why ancient cultures guarded them. In Egypt, names were bound to the soul. To erase a name was to curse someone in the afterlife. In medieval Europe, names were kept from demons, who could control you if they spoke it. Even today, witness protection changes names first, because without your name, you vanish. But there's a catch. Names only work when they're real. Get one wrong, or fake it, and the magic dies. In 2012, a CEO giving a speech to new interns tried to impress by calling out names from memory.
But he mispronounced a Nigerian intern's name. Not once but twice. Despite having been corrected, the room stiffened. The intern smiled tightly, said nothing. Later, half the cohort wrote in anonymous feedback. He sees some of us, not all of us. The power of a name isn't just in saying it, it's in meaning it. It's in pronouncing it correctly, respectfully, because a name isn't just a label, it's a history. A girl named Tara, a boy named Yusuf, a non-binary student named Ren. Each name carries lineage, language, a choice made by someone who hoped that name would protect or inspire or bless. That's why forgetting a name stings more than forgetting a face. In dating, remembering names early has staggering impact. In a 2017 experiment published in the Journal of Personal Relationships, participants who had their name repeated within the first 10 minutes of a date rated their partner as 23% more attentive and 18% more attractive. The opposite, using generic terms like babe or you, caused a measurable drop in perceived sincerity. Names, it turns out, are romantic currency. They say, you specifically, not someone like you. You, which is why in moments of grief, names become everything. After 9/11s, when memorials were held in New York, the names were read aloud, one by one, for hours, thousands, not just statistics, not just victims, names, each one an entire life spoken into the air, so they wouldn't be forgotten. Because we don't cry for numbers, we cry for names. The night before he vanished, the journalist wrote a single name on the napkin, not a phone number, not a location, just a name, Nadia. When his body was found 3 days later, in the outskirts of Istanbul, there were no messages on his phone, no clue why he had crossed into that part of the city alone, no answers, except that napkin, crumpled in his coat pocket, stained with something that wasn't wine. Who was Nadia? No one could say, but she knew, because when the police quietly released his belongings, she came to the station, dark sunglasses, leather gloves in June, and said, "My name's Nadia, I'm the one he wrote." No proof, no ID, just that name. And still, they believed her, because saying a name, with weight, with intention, is its own kind of passport. You feel it when someone says it right, says it like it's part of your bones. Some names are shields, others, keys. In times of protest and power, names can burn through silence. In 2020, during the height of global demonstrations, protesters across the world chanted names, not slogans. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner. The rhythm of justice wasn't abstract, it was personal, real. The sound of the names echoed through streets not because of their syllables, but because each one cracked through political noise and said, this was a person, someone who existed, someone who didn't deserve to be erased. That's why authoritarian regimes erase names first. The disappeared in Argentina's dirty war weren't just killed, they were erased from records, from newspapers, from lists. Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo still walk in circles, holding signs with names, scrawled in black marker. That ink is rebellion. Every letter defies forgetting. Even in the world of espionage, names are both weapon and wound. In 1987, a KGB defector, named Victor, had one rule: never say your real name again. Not even to your handler, not to your wife, not in your sleep, because a name is traceable. It's the one thing that sticks to your soul, when everything else, language, accent, face can be changed. One day, during a rare lapse in control, he whispered a name. In his sleep, his wife heard it, wrote it down. 2 months later, she was gone. So was the file. He never spoke that name again. But in the silence where it once was, something fractured. In the world of branding and marketing, using someone's name isn't just connection, it's conversion. In 2018, Coca-Cola launched its global Share a Coke campaign, printing names on bottles, over 1,000 names. It became viral. Why? Because seeing your name on a product, even a soda, activated a primitive delight. People weren't buying a drink, they were buying recognition. Sales spiked 11%, not because the recipe changed, but because the bottle said, Rachel, in emails. Marketers know this trick too well. Subject lines with your name are 29% more likely to be opened. Sarah, we thought you'd love this. David, this sale won't last long. It doesn't matter that it's automated. Your brain still responds, still flinches at the intimacy. But names only work when you don't abuse them. Say someone's name too often or too soon, and it starts to feel like a tactic, not a tribute. That's why manipulative figures in cults or coercive relationships often overuse names. At first, you understand me. Ethan, you're strong, Elena. I can see that. It builds a false mirror, not reflection, but projection. A therapist once said, the abuser is always the one who says your name just before they hurt you. That's the danger. Names are not neutral. They can be prayers or triggers. In therapy, saying a name aloud for the first time can be an act of healing or a shattering collapse. Survivors of violence often avoid names of abusers, not out of fear, but because names carry presence. Say the name, and the memory arrives, with scent, with sound, with fists. But avoiding the name means it owns you. That's why in trauma recovery, some therapists gently guide clients back to naming not just people, but self. Say your name, they'll say, out loud, and when the voice breaks, and the name finally comes, the room holds its breath. Because claiming your name, especially after being told you don't matter, is defiance. A woman named Sita did that once. She had fled a forced marriage, lost contact with her family, and entered witness protection. For 6 months, she used a fake name. But in session one day, she said, I want to say my name again, the one my grandmother gave me. She whispered, Sita, then wept. That name had survived everything. Names are also how we anchor ourselves in moments of disorientation. If you've ever been pulled from sleep in an emergency, the first thing someone says is your name. Not wake up, not run, but Sam, get up. Because names cut through fear. They bring the person back to themselves. Neurologists call it a cognitive jolt. It roots us in identity when everything else unravels. That's why in combat zones, medics say the soldier's name over and over. Stay with me, Mike. Mike, look at me. Mike, keep your eyes open. Because if Mike stops hearing his name, he may stop fighting. In love too, names are spells. There's a reason why someone whispering your name during intimacy hits different than any other word. It's not about sex. It's about being seen, fully, personally. In that second, it's not about pleasure. It's about presence. You, not baby, not baby, not you. You, say the name, and it lands like thunder. That's also why breakups feel crueler. When someone stops using your name, they switch to you. They generalize, strip the intimacy. The name disappears. The closeness dies. But when they still say it, days, weeks after, the wound stays open. Take care of yourself, Sam. Not take care. Because that one word tells you they still remember who you were to them, and maybe still are.
Dress one level higher in every room. The person who looks like they don't quite belong, because they're dressed just slightly better, quietly takes control of the room. No one knew who he was. He walked into the courtroom like he had been summoned by mistake. A navy wool coat in a sea of windbreakers, Italian leather shoes gliding across cracked linoleum. He didn't glance around, didn't fumble. He just sat in the back row, opened a black notebook, and waited. The case was local. A factory worker accused of insurance fraud. The prosecutor was tired. The defense attorney was nervous. But midway through opening arguments, the man in the coat leaned forward, crossed one leg over the other, and made a single notation. People noticed him, not because he said anything, but because he looked like he didn't need to say anything. That's the strange gravitational force of dressing one level higher. It whispers, not screams. And people listen. In 2014, researchers from Yale published a study in the journal Nature Human Behavior that became a quiet bomb in business psychology. Participants were assigned to negotiate fake deals. Half wore casual clothing, sweatshirts, jeans. The other half wore suits. The results: suit wearers earned $8.3 million more in total value across all negotiations. Why? Because their clothes affected not only how others saw them, but how they saw themselves. It's called enclothed cognition, coined by psychologists Hajo Adam and Adam Galinsky. The term refers to how clothing influences psychological processes. In their 2012 experiments, people wearing a lab coat performed significantly better on attention-related tasks, but only when told it was a doctor's coat. If it was called a painter's coat, performance dropped. Same fabric, same fit, different frame. That's the trick. What you wear doesn't just signal status, it rewires identity. That's why elite criminals don't dress like criminals. It's why Frank Abagnale, one of the most successful conmen in history, impersonated pilots and doctors with nothing but uniforms and confidence. In Catch Me If You Can, he says, "They looked at the outfit, they didn't look at me." He was telling the truth. Visual cues bypass logic. A man in a tailored coat speaks before he opens his mouth. A woman in a sharply cut blazer seems 10 seconds ahead of every question. Even in crisis, appearance distorts perception. In a social experiment run in London, a man in a torn hoodie collapsed on the sidewalk. Dozens passed by, ignored him. Minutes later, the same man, now in a tailored jacket and pressed shirt, collapsed again. In the same spot, within seconds, 3 people stopped to help. Same man, same fall, different uniform. This isn't vanity, it's survival instinct. Humans have always read clothing as proxy for power, threat, tribe. Our ancestors judged feathers, paint, bone. Today, we judge fabric, weight, cut, fit. It's unconscious, but relentless. That's why in Silicon Valley, the supposed capital of hoodies, boardroom decisions are often made by people who dress just above the expected baseline. Not full suits, but smarter than the room, slightly, intentionally. A startup founder named Dana once walked into her first investor meeting in black jeans and a soft blazer. She noticed the other founders wore hoodies, one even wore Crocs. She closed her pitch with poise and a quiet smile. Afterward, one VC said, "You looked like you'd already made it." She raised $6.2 million because she dressed like someone they already trusted with that kind of money. In politics, the principle is more subtle and more powerful. Angela Merkel was famous for her uniform jackets, different colors, same structure. That consistency was no accident. In focus groups across Germany, people described her look as stable, familiar, competent. Her clothing became visual policy: calm, control, no chaos. She wasn't dazzling, she was dependable. Contrast that with someone like Emmanuel Macron, whose tailored suits sparked media coverage not for their elegance, but for their message. Early in his presidency, Macron was caught spending $26,000 on makeup and grooming. Criticism erupted, but stylists pointed out he was building an image of sleek globalism. Like it or not, his appearance told a story. Clothes always tell stories, even in war. In Afghanistan, US soldiers noticed something strange. Civilians who wore slightly cleaner clothes, shoes intact, shirt tucked, were often community leaders, even if no one admitted it. Their appearance earned them quiet respect. Even the Taliban targeted these men first, because influence wears armor, and sometimes that armor is linen and leather. In one village, a translator named Rafi said, "If your collar is ironed, they treat you like a judge." That wasn't metaphor, it was survival. In interrogation rooms, Suspects dressed one level higher are statistically more likely to delay arrest. Their appearance slows assumptions. One detective admitted, if a guy walks in with a $200 haircut and perfect cuffs, I pause. I don't want to be wrong. Appearance slows aggression, but it also accelerates opportunity. A woman named Julia once applied for a position at a media company known for its relaxed culture. During the final round, she wore a sharply tailored navy dress. The panel wore t-shirts and denim. Someone joked, "You're making us look bad." She smiled. "I thought I was interviewing to be your boss." They offered her the position. She declined. Dressing one level higher isn't about arrogance. It's about atmosphere. It tells the room, I prepared. I respected this moment enough to rise one notch above it. And that's magnetic, even in dating, where authenticity is sacred. Dressing up slightly changes perception. A study by Princeton psychologist Dr. Alexander Todorov showed that participants assessed strangers in 1/10 of a second, based solely on face and clothing. Those wearing sharper, darker structured outfits were seen as more competent, more attractive, and more dominant, all before a single word. And the effect doesn't fade. In fact, it compounds, because first impressions don't just shape how people see us. They shape how we see ourselves. When you dress one level higher, you behave one level higher. Shoulders back, voice steady, hands controlled. People respond to that and mirror it. A loop forms. You act sharp. They treat you sharp. So you become sharper. Self-fulfilling fashion. In a cafe in Berlin, a musician named Thomas, dressed in turtlenecks and long coats, even when unemployed. Friends laughed, called him professor, but one day a woman approached him while he was reading in the corner. "What do you teach?" she asked. He smiled. "Nothing yet." That woman helped him apply for a grant. He became a lecturer. It wasn't the clothes, but it started with the clothes. He walked into the interview with a linen blazer, dark jeans, and polished brown shoes. The role was entry level. No one else in the waiting room was dressed above smart casual. But when the recruiter came out and saw him, her expression shifted. "You must be Christopher," she said. He hadn't told her his name. He got the job before they finished the second round. It wasn't because he was better qualified. It wasn't because he answered more sharply. It was because the recruiter had already placed him one level above the role, unconsciously, before he'd opened his mouth. This happens more often than we admit. Clothes are shortcuts. Our brains, addicted to efficiency, make decisions faster than we realize. And in those split seconds, visual cues dominate logic. One experiment at Harvard in 2016 had two identical speakers give a 60-second pitch. Same voice, same words, same tone. The only difference, one wore a fitted navy blazer over a t-shirt, the other wore a hoodie. When judged by a live audience, the blazered speaker was rated 21% more competent, 18% more trustworthy, and 27% more likely to be hired. Same voice, different signal. This isn't about suits versus hoodies. It's about signal versus background. Because when you dress one level higher, you create friction, just enough to make people wonder, who is this? That sliver of curiosity keeps you on their radar longer. And in a world of forgettable noise, memorability is leverage. That's why the FBI teaches agents to dress 10–15% more formal than the people they're interrogating. Not to intimidate, but to anchor control. Not full suits in a rural sheriff's office, but definitely more polished than the room. It creates subconscious asymmetry. I lead, you follow. But this technique isn't limited to law enforcement. In Hollywood, actors use it to own auditions, without ever speaking a line. A casting director once told a young actress, "Dress like the character, but better." She walked in wearing a crisp white blouse, black pencil skirt, and simple heels. Not what the character would wear, but what the best version of the character would wear. She got the role before reading. Why? Because she looked like the decision had already been made. In street-level survival,
This principle plays differently, but no less effectively. In Bogota, a teenage girl named Alondra worked as a street seller. Most wore layers of worn fabric, oversized jackets, faces tired. Alondra wore fitted black pants, clean sneakers, a white shirt she washed nightly, and a blazer she'd found at a market. In 3 months, she tripled her tips. One morning, a businessman stopped and said, "You don't belong here, do you?" She smiled. Not for long. She wasn't lying. 2 years later, she managed a shop near the cathedral. Because her clothes told a story her reality hadn't caught up to yet. But it's not always about rising. Sometimes dressing higher protects. During the Rwandan evacuations in 1994, a Canadian journalist recounted how one local translator was spared when a militia group raided their vehicle. Everyone inside wore basic street clothes. He, however, had on a pressed blue Oxford shirt, something rare in that environment. One soldier pointed and asked, "You in?" The group nodded. The militia left. The shirt wasn't protection, but it looked like it, and that was enough. In modern warfare, elite operatives often blend using intentional elevation, not camouflage, but the opposite, looking just sharp enough to be non-target. In Ukraine, undercover operatives use clean black coats and urban shoes to blend into Kyiv cafes while gathering intel. The better you look, one said, the more people assume you're not the danger. This tactic even applies in digital spaces. Influencers who dress just slightly more polished than their niche stand out faster. A fitness coach in gym clothes blends. A fitness coach in monochrome layers with structured jackets gets branded. One TikTok strategist called it controlled contrast. You're not flashy, you're just half a step ahead, and that's all it takes. In human memory, contrast equals stickiness. When everything around you is denim, wear structured black. When everyone's in hoodies, try a collared knit, not to insult the room, but to rise above its expectations. There's a strange truth in confidence dynamics. People don't want leaders who look like them. They want leaders who look like a future version of themselves. That's why Steve Jobs wore a uniform, not just to simplify choice, but to symbolize authority without conformity. A black turtleneck in a world of suits. That was a power move, one level higher than tech nerds, but one level below Fortune 500's. Strategic equilibrium. Even fashion icons understand this. Anna Wintour's bob and sunglasses aren't just style, they're armor. Her wardrobe isn't extravagant. It's precise, clean, elevated, balanced. No need to be wild when you own the room. When asked why she repeats silhouettes, she once said, "Consistency breeds clarity, but there's danger too. Dressing too high creates distance. Dressing too low creates doubt. But just one level above, you become aspirational, not arrogant. That's the art." In 2021, an experiment in Nairobi showed that job candidates who wore one notch higher than local expectation were twice as likely to be remembered, and 33% more likely to be called back. Even if their experience was mid-range, their applications weren't stronger, their shirts were. In prison dynamics, appearance can mark rank. A man named Leon once said, "The sharpest guy in the unit, he wasn't the biggest, he just wore the cleanest shoes." That was power. In a place where survival depends on perception, looking one step cleaner meant "don't touch me," not because he could fight, but because he looked like someone others would protect. In rehab centers, counselors teach patients to dress better as recovery stabilizers, not to impress, to remember who they are. A clean hoodie, pressed jeans, real shoes, they're symbols, visual mantras. I am worth structure. I am someone coming back. One patient, after 6 months sober, walked into the meeting in a navy cardigan. Someone said, "You look different." He answered, "I feel like someone who can be trusted again." That's the heart of dressing one level higher. It doesn't fake identity, it invites it. It becomes the costume of the person you're becoming, until you realize it's not a costume anymore.
The 5:1 ratio in relationships. For every single negative moment, you need 5 positive ones to stay emotionally balanced, not to erase pain, but to keep love alive. She couldn't remember what he said, not the words, not exactly, just the feeling, that sting just behind the eyes, the sudden quiet that falls after someone hits a nerve they didn't know you still had. It was Tuesday, 7:12 p.m., kitchen light buzzing above them like an exposed wire. He'd said something about the dishes, or the way she sighed, maybe both. But what she remembered wasn't the sentence, it was the silence after it. The look he didn't give her, the space that didn't close. One moment, one drop in the ocean. But it never fell alone, because in love, negative moments don't come alone. They come heavy, loud, sticky, and to survive one, just one, you need 5 good ones to balance the scale. Dr. John Gottman, the world's leading researcher on marital stability, discovered this during decades of observation. In his love lab at the University of Washington, he filmed couples in ordinary conversations, breakfast, budgeting, small frustrations, then tracked them over years. The pattern was clear. Couples who stayed together had at least 5 positive interactions for every negative one. Those who didn't, the ratio slipped, 4-1, 3-1, then collapse. It's called the magic ratio, not because it's cute, because it's biological. Negativity has more psychological weight than positivity. That's a survival feature. We remember threats more than praise. A single scowl lingers longer than 5 smiles. One insult burns deeper than a week of compliments. That's how our nervous system evolved. So to fight that imbalance, relationships must overcompensate, with kindness, with gestures, with laughter, 5-1, or you bleed. In 2003, a couple named Miguel and Jen agreed to join one of Gottman's studies. On camera, they looked fine, they laughed, shared coffee, but when Jen said, "You never really hear me when I talk," Miguel rolled his eyes, just a flicker, one twitch. That eye roll predicted divorce within 3 years. It's called contempt, the deadliest of the 4 horsemen of relationship apocalypse, alongside criticism, defensiveness, and stonewalling. But contempt is lethal, because it erases the need for repair. It says, "You're not worth fixing this." And once contempt shows up, it takes more than 5 positives to survive. But here's the twist. The 5 positives don't have to be grand. They can be small, tiny, even. A squeeze on the arm, an inside joke, a shared smile during traffic, a quiet thank you while passing the salt. These aren't filler, they're stitches. Every relationship bleeds. The question is, are you sewing or leaving it open? In 2010, a firefighter named Ray described how he and his wife kept from drifting apart after his 3rd deployment. "Every time I left," he said, "I left one note for each day I'd be gone. Some stupid, some serious. But she said that saved us. That's 93 notes for one absence. That's a 93-1 ratio. And maybe that's why they made it. Because the truth is, love doesn't break from a single bad night. It breaks when the positive doesn't keep up, when resentment outruns repair." A woman named Kayla told her therapist, "It wasn't the cheating, it was that for 5 years, he forgot my birthday." Neglect isn't always cruelty. Sometimes it's just subtraction, and subtraction kills. Think of trust like a bank account. Every compliment, hug, shared laugh, that's a deposit. Every criticism, dismissal, glare, that's a withdrawal. Too many bad days in a row, and you overdraft the whole thing. In healthy couples, those micro moments build immunity. He forgets to text, "Okay, but he left coffee on your nightstand." She snaps at you, "Okay, but she also saved your favorite clip to watch later." Without those positives, every mistake becomes betrayal. But with them, forgiveness becomes reflex. One therapist said, "The strongest couples don't fight less, they just recover faster." because recovery is the muscle, not perfection. Recovery, and recovery runs on 5-to-1. Even in childhood, the ratio applies. In school classrooms, children need roughly 5 positive reinforcements for every single correction to thrive emotionally. Teachers who use sarcasm, impatience, or criticism without balancing them with warmth statistically lower self-esteem scores in students within a month. We don't grow out of this. Adults are just kids in better costumes. In war zones, relationships either harden or evaporate under the same ratio. In Syria, a field medic named Rana said, "We stopped trying to protect each other. We tried to remember to smile once a day, no matter what. That kept us human." That smile, in the middle of a city on fire, was worth 5 apologies, because positivity in crisis isn't denial, it's glue. But not all positive moments count. They have to be real. A forced compliment doesn't heal a harsh word. A manipulative gift doesn't undo betrayal. The 5 must carry sincerity, like the way someone looks at you when they think you're not watching, or the way they reach for your hand when the movie gets too quiet, or the softness in their voice when they say your name, even when they're angry. That's what lands. That's what saves. In one marriage intensive, a couple was asked to list the last 5 meaningful gestures they gave each other. He couldn't name one. She had 3, but all over 6 months old. They didn't make it, because even the deepest love erodes without maintenance. The rain doesn't care how strong the roof once was. It only matters who patched it last. The last time he touched her shoulder, she flinched, not from pain, from absence. From how unfamiliar his hand now felt, like being touched by a stranger who used to be home. They hadn't fought lately, not really. No slammed doors, no betrayal, but also no smiles, no coffee brought to bed, no midnight laughter, no dancing in the kitchen, just absence, long, dry absence. And that's how relationships die most often, not by fire, but by drought. Because the 5-1 ratio doesn't just heal damage, it prevents death. Neglect has a whisper, but it carves deep. In 2008, a therapist named Rachel Harling tracked couples in post-crisis recovery, war survivors, people rebuilding after infidelity, families of addiction. She noticed something strange. The relationships that survived didn't avoid conflict, they didn't avoid pain. But they rebuilt with relentless smallness. A joke, a squeeze, a sandwich left in the fridge with a sticky note, "Still here." Those things saved them. One man said, "After I got out of prison, my wife left a spoonful of peanut butter for me each morning, always in the same bowl, no message." But that was the message. They're still together. Because when you've hurt someone, or broken, or lost your voice, you can't win back love in a speech. You win it one spoon at a time. This is true even in the most extreme places. In hostage negotiations, FBI behavioral analysts use a variation of the 5-1 ratio during extended contact. For every direct command or stress-inducing phrase, "We need you to release them now," they offer 5 smaller moments of affirmation, calling the subject by name, acknowledging their fear, sharing something human, not to manipulate, to keep them tethered. Because when people are spiraling, in crisis, in panic, in despair, 5 good anchors are the minimum, to keep them from drifting away. This math shows up in therapy too. A patient in trauma treatment will often regress after a breakthrough. They'll lash out, shut down, say something cruel. The therapist doesn't meet that with confrontation, but with small acts of steady repair. A mirror tilt, a softened tone, a reminder, "You're still safe here." Not a grand gesture, a low flame. Because healing isn't loud, it's persistent. So is love. And yet, most people don't know they're bleeding until the balance is gone. A woman named Maris told her best friend, "I think we're fine." 2 months later, her husband left. In the note he wrote, "I waited 2 years for us to feel easy again. I just couldn't find 5 good things anymore." She read it over and over. Then she made a list. 1. He bought me a jacket last year. 2. He texted me when my dad was sick.
3. The list ended there, because 5 isn't a metaphor, it's a threshold. In a training for crisis couples, a therapist held up a rubber band. She stretched it tight. This is your relationship under tension. Now give me 5 reasons it won't snap. Someone called out, "We've been through worse." Okay. 1. Another said, "We raised a daughter together." 2. A pause, silence, snap. That's how it works. But there's hope, because it doesn't take perfection. It just takes 5. A firefighter once wrote letters to his wife from deployment. He missed their anniversary, forgot their dog's surgery. She was furious, said she'd given up. Then the box arrived. It wasn't flowers. It was 5 letters, all handwritten. "The first time I saw you in the red dress. The way your voice sounds when you read to our son. The sandwich you made me in July that still haunts me. How you forgave me in year 2. Why I want to come home." She didn't respond immediately, but she didn't leave. 3 months later, she wrote back, 1 sentence. That was 5. Forgiveness doesn't erase, it outweighs. Even the body knows this. In neuroimaging studies, subjects exposed to verbal criticism showed prolonged amygdala activation, stress, defense, retreat. But when that criticism was preceded or followed by affirming statements, prefrontal cortex activity increased. Higher reasoning, emotional regulation, meaning the brain can hold pain if it's cushioned in recognition. You hurt me, but you also see me. That's what the 5 do. In elderly care homes, patients with memory loss often experience sundowning, agitation at twilight. But caregivers trained in emotional patterning use 5 positive gestures for every correction. A joke, a compliment, a gentle reminder, a warm tone, a shared memory. One nurse said, "If I need to say no, I wrap it in yes." That strategy, 5 emotional yeses per no, reduces aggression by 40%, because even people losing their names remember how you made them feel. And what's love, if not emotional pattern? One widower said, "The thing I miss most isn't her body. It's the 5 tiny things she did every morning, before I left for work, even when we were mad." Those 5 things were moving his keys to the left side of the table, turning the coffee pot to face the door, placing a napkin in his lunchbox. No note, just the napkin, pulling back the curtain 1 inch more than usual, saying, "Make 'em scared of how good you are." Every morning, for 34 years, he didn't realize what they meant until they were gone. That's the danger of the 5-1 ratio. It works invisibly until it disappears, and then all you feel is the 1.
The confidence loop. Confidence doesn't come first. Body language does. Your brain doesn't lead your posture. Your posture leads your brain. He walked into the courtroom like he owned it. Chin high, steps measured, jaw still. He didn't speak until he reached the defense table. And when he did, the jury leaned in. Not because of what he said, but because of how he stood. What they didn't know was that 30 minutes earlier, in the men's bathroom, he had been shaking. Andrew Leeds, 39. First major federal case, hands trembling so badly, he couldn't zip his suit properly, but he remembered the rule. Shoulders back, eye steady, hands open, breathe low and slow. He didn't feel confident. He looked it, and that was enough to start the loop. The confidence loop isn't a myth. It's not a pep talk. It's biology. Your body shapes your brain in real time, not the other way around. In 2010, Harvard researcher Amy Cuddy conducted a study that shocked the psychological world. Participants were asked to pose in either high power or low power positions for just 2 minutes. High power, expansive, open, upright. Low power, hunched, arms folded, looking down. The results: testosterone, the dominance hormone, increased by 20% in high power poses. Cortisol, the stress hormone, dropped by 25%. But in the low power group, the reverse. The pose changed the chemistry, not the speech, not the thoughts, the posture. And what followed was even more important. Those who adopted high-power poses were significantly more likely to take risk, speak up, or perform under pressure, because the brain watches the body and follows. This is the secret no one teaches in school. Confidence isn't a personality trait. It's a behavior, a posture, a loop between what you do and what your mind believes about you. That's why elite athletes walk into arenas with deliberate slowness. Why Navy SEALs stand still before missions. Why performers take 10 seconds alone in the wings to adjust their breath, not to calm down, to code themselves. In 2016, a group of European researchers outfitted participants with wearable sensors and measured body responses to stress during interviews. Those who acted confident, regardless of how they felt, triggered neurological feedback that made them actually feel less anxious within minutes. It's a cheat code, but only if you commit to the action before the belief. That's what makes the loop work. Because confidence doesn't start with "I can do this." It starts with "What would someone who could do this do with their body right now?" Then copy it, and watch your brain catch up. That's what Eva did the night she met the ambassador. Eva was a junior diplomat, no speaking role. Just observe, take notes, don't spill wine. But when the senior envoy fainted mid-event, she had to step up, literally. She stood, took 2 seconds to center, and walked, not rushed, toward the podium. She spoke clearly, hands still, no fidgeting, no panic. Only later did people ask where she trained her public speaking. She hadn't. She mimicked the posture of her mentor, and her brain followed. That's the loop. It's why actors can play bold characters and leave the set more confident than they were. Why people who take ballroom dance stand differently after 6 months. Why wearing a tailored jacket doesn't just look different, it makes you behave different. Because movement is code. The shoulders you roll back today rewrite your self-perception tomorrow. Even criminals understand this. Frank Abagnale, the famous con artist turned FBI consultant, once said, "I didn't forge documents, I forged confidence." The posture came first, always the posture. In his early days, impersonating a pilot, he had no credentials, but he walked like someone who owned the air, and people believed him, because confidence, even faked, makes people relax, and relaxed people stop checking. It's the same in corporate hiring. A 2019 study showed that job candidates who made deliberate eye contact, kept open gestures, and moved slowly through their answers were rated as more intelligent and higher worthy, even when their answers were identical to other applicants. Perception doesn't just follow reality, it creates it. Ask any magician, ask any interrogator, ask any first date charmer. Your body speaks truth, your voice hasn't earned yet, and when you train that language, your brain eventually follows suit. But the loop works both ways. Negative posture leads to negative thoughts. Sit slouched, arms crossed, jaw tight, your mood shifts downward. In one experiment, participants asked to recall a happy memory, did worse when seated in a collapsed position, because posture doesn't just reflect mood, it restricts access to it. There's a reason military cadets are taught to stand at attention before they're given orders. Structure first, identity later. The loop. In therapy, this becomes a survival mechanism. A trauma patient may never feel brave enough to speak, but if they sit upright, breathe deeply, and hold eye contact, the brain gets a new message. Maybe we're safer than we thought. One woman, healing from years of abuse, was taught to raise her chin whenever she entered a room. "I didn't feel strong," she said, "but I looked strong, and people started treating me like I was. So eventually, I had to meet myself where I already looked like I belonged." Her recovery began, not with belief, but with behavior. That's the paradox of the confidence loop. We wait for courage to act, but action is what creates courage. Fake it till you make it. Close. It's fake it till your brain rewires around it. That's not dishonesty. That's neuroplasticity. In Tokyo, a violinist named Ren used to vomit before each concert. His teacher gave him an exercise before playing. Stand center stage for 10 seconds, say nothing, and breathe with his chest lifted. First concert, he lasted 4 seconds. Second 7. By the third, the audience leaned forward before he even touched the bow. His playing didn't improve, his presence did. Because confidence isn't what you feel, it's what you frame. And the frame tells the story. There was a man in Moscow who convinced an entire room of generals he belonged there, simply by how he walked through the door. No badge, no clearance, just posture. He stepped across the marble, nodded once, paused long enough to own the silence, then walked past security without being stopped. Everyone assumed someone else had cleared him. He stood against the back wall, watched, made notes. 37 minutes later, he left, and only then did anyone realize they had no idea who he was. That was 1998. To this day, his identity is unknown, but intelligence analysts agree he was a mirror, a confidence mimic. He belonged because his body said so. That's the loop. In military training, confidence is drilled through simulation. Soldiers are taught to act like the mission is already done, not out of arrogance, but to override hesitation. In stress testing, recruits who stand taller and breathe deeper survive longer. In controlled panic scenarios, not because they're braver, but because the loop fools the brain long enough to buy time. Then time saves lives. In 2007, during a hostage crisis in Lagos, a female negotiator named Oshieta entered a room full of armed men who hadn't let anyone speak for 14 hours. She didn't scream, she didn't bargain, she sat, crossed her legs, looked each man in the eyes, one by one, didn't blink. They let her speak. Later, one of the captors said, "She didn't flinch, so we listened." Oshieti later admitted her knees were shaking under the table. But that's the loop. Behave before you believe, and belief will catch up. It works even in fabricated spaces, like the internet. On TikTok, creators often go viral, not because of content, but because of controlled presence, eye contact, stillness, breathing. One creator, unknown, 2 years ago, built an audience of 7 million. By doing nothing, but talking slowly, pausing, holding gaze with the camera, and speaking with gravity. She wasn't more insightful, she was more still, and the stillness projected power. That's a micro loop, and it's everywhere. In 2022, MIT researchers analyzed over 900 short videos and found a pattern: creators who maintained deliberate head movement and symmetrical gestures retained viewer attention 37% longer, even when saying the same words. The brain trusted the image more when the body language was congruent. Congruence equals sign credibility, not facts. Posture, even among liars. Confidence doesn't equal truth, it equals influence. That's why some of history's most convincing frauds weren't slick talkers, they were grounded presences. Elizabeth Holmes, for example, studied Steve Jobs' posture, voice tone, and pacing. Her pitch changed when her spine stiffened. People didn't trust her because of the science, they trusted her stillness. Later, that stillness became a mask, but it had already worked. The loop doesn't know morality, it only knows consistency. If you move like a leader, sound like a leader, hold yourself like a leader, your brain believes it, so does theirs. That's why cult leaders rarely scream. They speak slowly, use space, use silence. The loop becomes their stage. But what happens when the loop breaks? When someone loses control of their body? In courtrooms, jurors unconsciously track defendant body language, especially in high-profile cases.
One prosecutor said, if they flinch when shown a weapon, the jury flinches too. If they stare cold, the room tightens. In one trial, a defendant smiled, just slightly. When evidence was read, no one mentioned it. But the verdict came back guilty. The loop betrayed him. Because your body always loops, whether it's conscious or not. That's why some therapists use reverse loop therapy, helping clients unlearn patterns. A man recovering from narcissistic abuse was taught to soften his shoulders, uncross his arms, slow his speech. I felt fake at first, he said, but then I noticed people weren't scared of me anymore. He had armored himself in tension for so long, he didn't know what real felt like, until the posture changed, and the brain followed. Actors know this better than anyone. In 2013, an actress named Hannah played a role that required her to stand still under pressure, not flinch when screamed at. She practiced by holding eye contact with herself in a mirror for 10 minutes daily. No blinking, no swallowing, just breathing. On stage, it was hypnotic. Off stage, it changed her. She started negotiating better, stopped apologizing before speaking, left a toxic relationship. I wasn't acting anymore, she said. I just became her. That's the loop. You act it, and one day you are it. In prisons it works the same, but harsher. A man named Maloop once said, you walk different inside. If you don't, they'll teach you. He learned to keep his shoulders square, eyes half-focused, jaw steady. Even if you're scared, you never show your teeth. That's not just pride, that's safety. His posture got him through 6 years without a broken rib. When he got out, he couldn't unlearn it. His girlfriend told him, you're always ready for war. So he started yoga, not for peace, but to reset the loop, to move his body like someone safe, and wait for his brain to believe him again. That's the hardest part, unwiring a loop built for survival, because the loop doesn't care what built it, it just plays what it's told, and that means you can write a new one. Right now, stand up, square your feet, lift your spine like something precious, take a slow full breath, look directly at the next person who speaks to you, speak half as fast as you want to, and you've already started. You don't need to feel it, you need to perform it, and let the feeling follow. That's not pretending, that's programming.
90-minute sleep cycles. Sleep isn't a straight line. It runs in loops, roughly 90 minutes each. Light sleep, deep sleep, REM, and where you wake matters more than how long you slept. He died at 2:34 a.m. and came back at 2:36. The medical chart called it transient flatline, a 2-minute gap where his heart paused and the machine screamed, but he remembered it as a silence. Not peace, not light, just a silence, like someone had taken the world off the hook. And then he gasped, awake, drenched, eyes wild, chest heaving, and the first thing he said, I wasn't supposed to wake up then. The nurses didn't understand, but sleep researchers might have, because waking mid-cycle, especially during the wrong part of the loop, can feel like drowning in memory, confusion, rage, or grief. Then most people do it every day. Sleep isn't uniform. It isn't rest. It's rotation, a cycle of stages, each with its own neurochemical rhythm. A full cycle lasts about 90 minutes, though it varies slightly per person. Each loop includes light sleep stage 1 and 2, the bridge in, heart rate drops, breathing slows, the brain begins to drift from external stimuli. It's easy to wake here. Deep sleep stage 3, the body heals, growth hormone is released, muscles recover. This is when your immune system resets. Waking here feels like walking through wet cement. REM sleep stage 4, where dreams happen. The brain becomes wildly active while the body paralyzes itself. Memory consolidates. Emotions are processed. Creativity blooms. Waking just after REM often means vivid dreams, or even insight, and then the loop begins again. Most adults cycle through this pattern 4-6 times per night. The key is not how many hours you sleep, but whether you complete the cycles. That's why waking after 7.5 hours often feels better than waking after 8. Because if 8 hours interrupts a loop, your brain is yanked mid-process, like pulling a USB mid-transfer. It's not the length that hurts, it's the timing. In 2015, a study published in the journal Sleep followed 3,000 participants across 3 years. Those who scheduled sleep in multiples of 90 minutes, even if less than 8 hours, reported higher cognitive clarity, better reaction time, and stronger emotional regulation than those sleeping a solid 8 without regard to cycles. This isn't myth, it's math, and misjudging it can have strange consequences. A pilot named Darren once flew international routes for 11 years. He swore by 90-minute splits, pre-flight, mid-flight, and post-flight. If I sleep 3 hours, I'm golden. If I sleep 4, I'm a zombie. It became so ingrained that his co-pilot once said, "He can land a plane in Beijing better off 6 hours than I can on 8. Why? Because Darren knew the edge of the cycle and never jumped off mid-turn. But the problem is, most people do, every morning. That's why you feel groggy, even after a full night. It's called sleep inertia, the fog that hits when you wake in the wrong stage. Inertia can last 30-90 minutes, depending on where you were when the alarm shattered the loop. That's why some mornings feel like resurrection, others, like exile. Even in controlled environments, the effects are dramatic. In a Swedish hospital trial, nurses on 7.5-hour loop-aware shifts performed 23% better on reaction tests than those on rigid 8-hour schedules. One doctor remarked, "It's not just how long you sleep, it's how gracefully you surface." The idea is ancient. Before artificial light, humans didn't sleep in one long chunk. They followed segmented sleep, 2 long blocks of 3 or 4 cycles, split by a period of wakefulness around midnight. In those hours, people prayed, talked quietly, even wrote. In 13th century England, the second sleep was called second slumber, and it was precious, because the body remembered the loop. Even now, if you let your body drift naturally, no screens, no alarm, you'll likely sleep in exact 90-minute pulses. It's wired in. Your REM increases as morning nears. Your deep sleep dominates the first half. And when you ignore this, force yourself to rise during deep, you pay. Cognitively, emotionally, sometimes even spiritually. That's what happened to Claire. She was a neurobiology student in Marseille, high-performing, hyper-scheduled. For 6 weeks, she slept exactly 8 hours every night, and for 6 weeks, she started waking up panicked, dizzy, disoriented. The professor gave her one instruction: set her alarm 30 minutes earlier, to 7.5 hours. By the 3rd day, the panic was gone. Because she had been waking mid-cycle, her body needed less time, but more completion. Even dream recall changed. REM cycles sharpen as the night progresses, each one longer, deeper, more vivid. That's why dreams get stranger the longer you sleep. And if you wake at the wrong edge, you're either cut before the message arrives, or you carry it back broken. A man named Elias once dreamed the solution to a coding problem that had haunted him for 2 months. But when his alarm went off mid-cycle, the dream collapsed. "I woke up with the idea of the idea," he said, but not the actual thought. He moved his schedule to allow 6 or 7.5 hours. It happened again, 2 weeks later. This time, he woke after the cycle and remembered the entire algorithm. He patented it 6 months later. The idea wasn't lost, it just hadn't finished loading. That's the brain during REM. It doesn't file facts, it assembles meaning, but only if you let it finish. The Special Forces soldier had 60 seconds to choose. It was 4:31 in the field, cold, quiet. Their unit had rotated through 2 night watches already, eyes blurred, reflexes slower. The medic, Rodriguez, had collapsed against the Humvee, mumbling incoherently. They weren't under fire. Not yet. But they might be, and the captain had to decide. Call for evac or push into the canyon. He sat on the dirt, took 3 deep breaths, and chose to wait exactly 30 more minutes. Why? Because in 27 minutes, he'd complete his 4th 90-minute cycle. That would bring him to 6 hours, the minimum number his training had drilled into him. Complete sleep beats more sleep. He set his alarm for 5:01. He slept. At 5:02, he opened his eyes. Clear, breath even, head steady. The Rodriguez was stabilized by sunrise. They crossed the canyon. By noon, the loop saved 2 lives. Sleep experts embedded with Special Forces units in the 2010s began mapping tactical recovery models based on sleep cycles. The finding was simple but critical. 90-minute complete rest segments restore cognitive precision far better than fragmented naps, even if total time is lower. That's why elite operators sometimes rest in 3-hour bursts across 24 hours, not to cheat sleep, but to sync with it. Because you can't outsleep biology, you can only ride its rhythm. This is what Silicon Valley CEOs call structured sleep banking, deliberately aligning sleep and wake windows to match brainwave states. Elon Musk famously sleeps in 6-hour windows. Tim Cook rises at 3:45 a.m., which seems inhuman, until you realize he's finishing his 3rd 90-minute cycle just before waking. He goes to bed at 8:30 p.m. It's not sleep deprivation, it's sleep precision. Corporate sleep coaches, yes, they exist, now teach C-level executives how to sleep in rounds, not blocks. They're told don't aim for 8, aim for multiples of 90. 6 hours. Great. 7.5? Even better. 9. Perfect. Anything between. Risk inertia, grogginess, decision fatigue. Because if you wake during stage 3 deep sleep, your prefrontal cortex, the part that regulates logic and language, can take up to 60 minutes to boot. You don't feel tired, you feel stupid. This principle once grounded an entire flight. In 2017, a commercial airline co-pilot miscalculated rest time and woke 47 minutes into a sleep cycle. He stepped into the cockpit slow to respond, eyes red, heart racing. Within 12 minutes, he had reversed 2 flight paths by accident. They grounded the plane and rewrote pilot rest protocol. Now many airlines train flight staff to nap in loops, 90, 180, or 270 minutes. Never less, never more, unless the body naturally rises. Even NASA follows this rule. Astronauts aboard the ISS experience constant solar exposure, 16 sunrises per Earth day. Their bodies rebel. So NASA developed a system of micro-block rest, structuring downtime into repeating 90-minute intervals, often using light cues to simulate dawn at the end of each cycle. Because waking at the right point matters more than sleeping enough. Even in prison, a man named Keyshawn once shared his story from solitary confinement. They kept the lights on, always. He lost track of day, time, but his body began following its own rhythm. Every 90 minutes, like clockwork, he would either dream or jolt. I didn't have a watch, he said, but my head became the clock. When guards began waking him at 87-minute intervals, on purpose, he began to unravel. Small hallucinations, then memory loss, then rage. The 3 minutes between deep and REM gone, every time. He later said, I would have confessed to things I didn't do if it meant they let me sleep to the bell, because your mind needs REM to stay whole, and REM waits at the end of the loop. It's not luxury, it's maintenance. In a university sleep lab in Toronto, students volunteered for sleep interruption experiments. One subject, Maya, said she didn't mind until they changed the interval from 90 to 75 minutes. That night, she reported increased anxiety, trouble speaking fluently, and memory confusion. Her EEG scans showed high residual delta waves, sleep brain waves that hadn't powered down correctly, like trying to drive a car while the engine's still rebooting. She was off,
and off, in high-performance environments, is danger. That's why Olympic athletes are now coached not just on form, but on looped rest. One trainer said, if your athlete wakes mid-cycle on race day, you've already lost. Because when it comes to performance under pressure, it's not about more sleep, it's about right sleep. Even for children, the rule holds. A study of over 10,000 school children in France found that students who slept in multiples of 90, including night sleep plus naps, scored up to 15% higher on recall tasks and standardized tests. One boy named Idris used to fall asleep mid-class until his mother changed his bedtime from 9:30 to 9 o'clock. That 30-minute difference brought him from 7.5 hours 5 cycles to 6. He woke easier, stayed awake. His teacher called it a personality transplant. It wasn't. It was alignment. Your body isn't lazy, it's rhythmic. Break the rhythm, and you break the mind, even in moments of collapse. In one of the most chilling cases, a woman named Marika collapsed in a Berlin cafe. Medics said it was a vasovagal response, her body flipping off. But a sleep researcher on the scene said something else. She'd been working 13 days, no rest longer than 4 hours, always interrupted. Her body stopped because it never finished anything. Marika survived. She now sleeps 6 hours, 4 cycles, nothing less. Because those 4 loops, they're not optional, they're maintenance logs for the brain.